Brandon Carter stood at the top of his high-rise penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows stretching behind him, revealing a sweeping view of the city skyline. The lights glittered like stars, traffic humming far below. He owned that skyline, at least large parts of it. His real estate empire, Carter Global Holdings, stretched across states. His name appeared in headlines, on Fortune magazine covers, and in conference halls where tycoons whispered his name with a mix of envy and awe. But none of it filled the silence of his home. The marble floors echoed with every step. The 10-room mansion had every luxury one could dream of: indoor pools, grand chandeliers, even a private theater. But what it lacked was warmth. The kind of warmth that comes from laughter at dinner, from someone waiting up for you, or from a genuine smile not sparked by status or wealth. Every night, Brandon returned to the same routine. Remove his cufflinks, toss his tailored blazer on the chaise, pour a drink, and stare at the muted TV. His phone never stopped buzzing. Investors, social invites, board members, but it all felt like noise. It had been years since he'd had a real conversation that wasn't transactional. At 36, Brandon had achieved what most only dream of, yet he often found himself lying awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering how something so grand could feel so empty. He had women, plenty, in fact. Models, entrepreneurs, influencers, each one more dazzling than the last. They came and went like seasons. They smiled, laughed, kissed his cheek at galas, and praised his brilliance. But in the quiet hours, when he looked past the makeup and designer gowns, he saw the truth. None of them knew him. Not really. And worse, none of them cared to. It wasn't always like this. Years ago, Brandon believed in love. He remembered college, when money wasn't his identity, when he rode the subway and shared street food dates with someone who held his hand because they liked him, not his last name. But fame, as it turned out, had a price, and he'd paid it in isolation. His most recent relationship had seemed different, or so he thought. Jenna, a sophisticated marketing executive with charm and grace, had met him at a charity event. She was witty, attentive, and made him feel seen. For the first time in years, he let his guard down. He told her stories he hadn't told anyone. He imagined a future, even bought a ring. But fate had different plans. One morning, returning early from a business trip, Brandon stepped into his office to grab a forgotten document. He wasn't supposed to be there, and maybe that's why the scene hit so hard. Laughter floated from behind the frosted glass of the executive lounge. Curious, he pushed the door open and froze. Jenna, his Jenna, was sitting intimately close with his chief financial officer. They were laughing, touching, completely unaware of the man whose heart had just cracked open at the threshold. Brandon didn't say a word. He didn't storm in. He didn't yell. He just stood there, let the image burn into his memory, and turned around. That day, something in him broke. He cancelled the engagement, fired the CFO, closed his doors to the world. For days, he stayed inside his mansion, refusing calls and meetings. Emily, his loyal assistant, was the only one who dared to check on him, and even she received only silence at the door. The betrayal wasn't just about love, it was about trust, about vulnerability, about realizing that no matter how successful or generous he was, people still saw him as a prize, a stepping stone, or a paycheck. That night, as rain tapped rhythmically against the glass walls, Brandon stood alone, staring at his reflection. His tailored robe, sleek hair, and million-dollar view, it all looked impressive. But it wasn't him. Not really. And as thunder rolled across the sky, he whispered the question that had haunted him for years, but never aloud. Would anyone love me if I had nothing? It was the moment that would change everything, not because he had an answer, but because he finally admitted he needed one. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. Brandon sat by the fireplace, not for warmth, but for the silence it offered. He watched as the flames flickered across the glass of his whiskey tumbler, the amber liquid untouched. It was the middle of the afternoon, but time had blurred. He hadn't taken a meeting, checked his emails, or even opened the curtains that morning. The betrayal still stung. But deeper than the heartbreak was a creeping question, one that had lodged itself in his chest and refused to leave. What if this was all I am to people? A bank account, a ticket to power. The thought haunted him. He knew he couldn't live another decade pretending that money made up for emptiness. He had built a world where everything was polished, pristine, and professional, but not real, and he was done. That night, Brandon called Emily. She had been his assistant for almost 10 years, sharp, loyal, and one of the very few people who had never tried to manipulate him. He trusted her. When she picked up, he skipped the pleasantries. "Emily," he said, his voice low, firm, and slightly hoarse. "I need a favor. I want you to get me some old clothes, like second-hand, torn if possible. No brand names, no watch, just something a man with nothing would wear." There was a pause on the line. "Sir?" she asked, confused. "I'm not joking," he replied. "I want to look like I've lost everything. No car, no phone, just clothes, a pair of slippers, and maybe an old bag. Can you do that?" Emily paused again, trying to read between the lines. "Yes, sir," she finally said, her voice softer this time. "I'll have them delivered tomorrow." By sunrise, Brandon was already up. He stood in front of the mirror in one of the guest bathrooms, one he rarely entered, wearing a faded grey t-shirt, stained jeans with a hole in the knee, and a pair of worn-out sneakers that didn't quite fit. He looked nothing like himself. The carefully combed hair was left messy, the usual scent of expensive cologne replaced by plain soap. For the first time in years, he left his watch on the dresser. No phone, no wallet full of platinum cards. Just a small pouch with a few bills and coins. Even his posture changed. There was no need to walk like a man who ran boardrooms. That man was gone. For now. He didn't tell his family. His parents were overseas at a financial summit in Dubai. His siblings were busy managing regional branches. And the staff? He told them he was traveling abroad on a personal sabbatical. No one would look for him, at least not for a few weeks. He packed a small backpack and left through the service entrance just after dawn. The mansion remained quiet behind him. The housekeepers hadn't even begun their shifts. As he stepped onto the street, hoodie pulled low over his face, Brandon Carter vanished. He found a room to rent on the city's outskirts, in a neighborhood no one would associate with billionaires or boardrooms. The building leaned to one side, and the hallway smelled faintly of mold and burnt oil. The room itself had a thin mattress on the floor, a cracked window, and a bare light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The paint peeled off the walls like sunburned skin, and the fan made more noise than air. Brandon placed his bag down and sat cross-legged on the mattress. He took a deep breath. This was it. He had traded gold-plated fixtures for concrete cracks, silk sheets for rough linen, and catered meals for instant noodles. And he didn't feel regret, only anticipation. The next morning, he hit the streets. He offered to help street vendors move goods, carried cement for a local construction crew, and washed cars in a nearby parking lot. Everything was paid in small cash. No bank transfers, no tips for being a good guy. Just sweat and labor. By the third day, his hands were blistered. His back ached from bending, lifting, and walking miles. But for the first time in years, Brandon Carter wasn't being watched. He wasn't being evaluated, pitched to, or praised. He was just a guy trying to get by. And strangely, he liked it. At night, he sat by the cracked window, watching shadows stretch across the alley. He missed his bed, sure, but not the emptiness that came with it. That week, Emily set the next phase in motion. She used exclusive dating apps to arrange blind dates, telling each woman a fictional but plausible story. "You'll be meeting a man who once had a decent career, but lost everything during the economic crash. He's trying to rebuild. He's humble. He's kind." The photos she uploaded were of Brandon in his current state, bearded, unkempt, quietly sitting on a bench. No filters, no bios that bragged. Just a name, Ben. Each woman thought they were meeting a man starting over. Not one knew they were being met by a billionaire looking for something money couldn't buy. Love. Brandon knew the risks. Someone might recognize him. A photo could go viral, but somehow he didn't care. He had reached the point where truth mattered more than image. If he could find just one person, one woman, who saw the man beneath the dust and silence, then maybe all of this would be worth it. If not, then at least he would finally have his answer. As he folded his clothes and set them at the end of the thin mattress, he whispered to himself, "Let's find out what's real." And with that, the game began. Not a game of deception, but of revelation, one that would change his life forever. The morning Brandon moved into his new apartment, the city felt different. Not louder or quieter, just unfamiliar. His driver wasn't waiting at the gate. No assistant checked his calendar. No valet opened the door to a private suite. Instead, he stood outside a building that leaned slightly to one side, its concrete facade cracked like old skin. The hallway smelled of grease and cigarettes. The room was bare, just a mattress on the floor, one creaky fan spinning slowly above, and a bulb that flickered every few seconds. There was no silk bedding, no walk-in closet, and no espresso machine. Just dust, peeling paint, and a window that refused to close all the way. Brandon looked around, then dropped his duffel bag with a thud. This wasn't a punishment. It was a reset. He had ditched the suits, those custom-made $1,000 pieces that used to define his silhouette. Now he wore faded t-shirts, second-hand jeans, and worn sneakers with mismatched laces. He stopped shaving, letting a thick beard grow unevenly across his jawline. The mirror barely recognized him anymore, and for the first time in years, that was a relief. No one pointed at him in restaurants. No waiters rushed to reserve the best table. No strangers asked for selfies or pretended to bump into him just to talk. He was anonymous, invisible, just another man trying to get by in a crowded city. He wasn't Brandon Carter, the CEO. He was Ben, the quiet guy with tired eyes and calloused hands. Every day, he left the apartment at dawn and returned long after sunset. He pushed heavy carts at the market, helped construction crews mix cement, carried groceries for elderly vendors, and even cleaned alleyways for a few extra bucks. He was paid in wrinkled bills, small denominations folded and tucked into his pocket with gratitude or indifference. Some jobs paid more than others. None of them paid enough to matter. But Brandon wasn't after money. He was after experience, the kind that grounded him, stripped him of ego, and reminded him what life was like without shortcuts or silver spoons. His muscles ached, his fingers cracked, and his back stiffened from hours of labor. But inside, something else had started to heal. At night, he would return to the little room, change into a dry shirt, and sit by the window. No television, no streaming apps, just city sounds. Honking, dogs barking, voices rising and falling in nearby apartments. He sometimes talked to himself, other times just stared at the night sky. He thought about his past, about the people who smiled at him for cameras and clinked glasses at galas, but never called when he went silent. He remembered boardrooms, private flights, five-star suites, and how none of those things had brought him peace. It was humbling, even disorienting, to realize how much he had built, yet how little of it had ever really mattered to his soul. Meanwhile, Emily was quietly putting the next phase into motion. Using exclusive dating apps under a fake profile, she began arranging blind dates with carefully selected women. Each woman was told the same story. "You're meeting someone who used to be very successful but lost everything. He's starting over, doing small jobs, trying to find his footing again." She didn't use Brandon's real photo. Instead, she uploaded a recent image of him sitting on a park bench, scruffy and soft-eyed. There were no mentions of Carter Global Holdings, no hints about wealth, just the basics. Ben, mid-30s, once ambitious, now humbled, looking for connection, not perfection. Brandon agreed to meet each woman at a modest spot: roadside cafes, food stalls with plastic chairs, small diners with greasy menus and paper napkins. He always arrived early, ordered something simple, usually tea or pepper soup, and waited. His heart pounded every time. Not because he feared rejection, but because he feared repetition. Another smile that would turn sour once they realized he had nothing. Another conversation that would circle back to, "What do you do?" or "How much do you make?" Aye, but he had to try. He needed to know, was there a woman in this city, in this world, who could see beyond the dust on his shoes and the holes in his shirt? Could someone see him? Not his resume, not his net worth, but him? As he lay down that night, head resting on a pillow that smelled faintly of mildew and fabric softener, Brandon exhaled. The air was still, thick with humidity, but inside there was a strange clarity. He was no longer pretending to be someone else. He had stripped down to nothing, not to manipulate, but to understand. The journey wasn't glamorous, and the stakes weren't just emotional, they were existential. If love couldn't be found in honesty, then maybe it didn't exist at all. He turned off the flickering light, pulled the thin blanket over his chest, and whispered to himself, "Let's see what the world really thinks of a man with nothing." The first date was on a Thursday evening. The sky had just begun to blush orange, and the scent of grilled food drifted through the air. Brandon sat outside a small food stall called Tio's Kitchen, a humble place with plastic chairs, flickering lights, and a menu scrawled in chalk. He wore a faded blue shirt, frayed at the collar, and jeans that had seen better days. His hands still bore the grime from helping a carpenter fix a storefront earlier that day. He looked like exactly what he was pretending to be, someone down on his luck, trying to survive. When Madison arrived, she was easy to spot. Long blonde hair, sharp red heels, and a neon pink bodycon dress that turned every head on the street. She scanned the area, then paused as her eyes landed on him. Her expression twisted in confusion and mild horror. "You're Ben?" she asked, already pulling out her phone. Brandon stood and smiled politely. "Thanks for coming." She laughed, loudly. "You actually invited me here." "Like, here, here," she said, spinning in a half circle and waving her hand at the setting. "I thought this was a prank." Before he could answer, she grabbed her purse. "Next time, try dressing like a human being, not like someone who just rolled out of a dumpster." Then she was gone, leaving Brandon with an untouched glass of water and an awkward waitress offering a sympathetic shrug. He waited a while, paid for the drink, and walked home with quiet steps. He tried not to take it personally, but something in her reaction echoed a deeper truth. People didn't care about what they couldn't see. Without the expensive suit and private driver, he wasn't worth a second glance. Still, Brandon wasn't ready to give up. The second date came the following Monday at a roadside pepper soup joint. It was slightly more polished, with metal tables and fans that actually worked. Her name was Rachel, a lawyer, 32, driven and articulate. She arrived dressed professionally, blazer, slacks, a leather-bound notebook in hand. Brandon thought maybe this one would be different. From the moment she sat down, however, it felt less like a date and more like an interview. "So, you said you used to work in finance?" she asked, flipping open the notebook. "What kind of roles? Senior management? Did you handle budgets?" He answered vaguely, "Yeah, but things went south after the crash." She nodded, scribbled. "So what's your current income stream? Daily wages? Freelance?" He hesitated. "It varies. I do manual jobs, so it depends." She didn't smile once. She asked about credit score, rent, family background. She didn't touch her drink, didn't laugh at his jokes, didn't ask a single personal question. When the food arrived, she stood, closing her notebook. "I'll call you," she said, with a curt nod. She never did. That night, Brandon sat on the edge of his thin mattress, peeling off his shirt and staring at the ceiling. There was no anger, just fatigue. Dating, in his old world, had been about status, compatibility, image. Here, stripped of all that, it was worse. It was about calculation. Could he be a comeback story, a safe bet, a hidden gem? No one seemed to ask what he believed in, what made him laugh, what kept him up at night. They didn't want to know him. They wanted to assess him. And yet, he kept trying, because he had to believe that not all love had gone extinct. Vanessa was the third, and at first, she gave him hope. She met him at a cafe tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore, arriving in a casual sundress and sneakers. Her smile was warm, her tone gentle. "I'm glad you chose this spot," she said, sipping on lemonade. "It's cozy?" They talked for almost 2 hours. She asked about his childhood, his favorite music, his biggest fear. She told him about growing up in a crowded apartment with 3 sisters and how she always dreamed of opening a flower shop. She said she admired men who worked hard, who stayed humble even when life was tough. Brandon listened, his heart softening with each word. She seemed genuine, interested, kind, even playful. For the first time since he started this journey, he let his guard down. He even walked her home that evening, and she held his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I feel something real," she said. "Do you?" The next morning, he got a message. "Hey, love, I didn't want to ask, but I'm in a tough spot. My rent just expired, and I have nothing in the house to eat. Even a little help would mean so much. I really believe in us." Brandon stared at his phone. Less than 24 hours after their first meeting. Less than a day after her soft words and warm hands. Not a request for time or trust, but money. Always money, not love. Just another performance with a price tag. He didn't respond. He didn't delete her message either. He just let it sit there, a reminder of how kindness could be a costume too. That night, he walked the streets long after sunset. The city glowed in orange and purple, but Brandon only saw grey. He passed couples laughing on sidewalks, teens playing music near the park, even a woman arguing on the phone with someone she clearly loved. He envied all of them. Not for their stability or simplicity, but for their honesty. They weren't pretending. They weren't hiding behind masks. Brandon returned to his room and sat on the floor in silence. The sounds of rats in the wall and motorcycles outside buzzed around him, but he didn't hear any of it. In the span of 3 dates, he had hoped, he had opened up, and he had been disappointed. Again. He stared at the ceiling, a familiar question rising like smoke. Is this who we are now? Are we all just bargaining chips? He thought of Emily, of how she'd warned him that the world might not be ready for something real, and yet part of him refused to stop. Somewhere, deep beneath the exhaustion and bruised pride, Brandon Carter, the man, not the billionaire, still wanted to believe in something better. But if this was love at ground level, it was going to be a much lonelier climb than he ever imagined. Brandon sat cross-legged on the cold floor of his tiny room, a half-empty cup of instant coffee beside him, its steam long faded into the night air. The city outside was alive with sound, horns, footsteps, voices drifting through open windows, but inside his world there was only silence. The fan above him squeaked every few seconds, spinning slowly like the thoughts swirling in his mind. He replayed each of the dates one by one. Madison's disgusted look, Rachel's interrogation, Vanessa's carefully crafted sweetness that melted away into a financial plea. Each face, each word felt like another crack in the fragile hope he'd tried so hard to hold on to. He wasn't naive. He had always known the world could be shallow, but he had never realized how invisible a man could feel when he had nothing to offer. Not once during any of those conversations did someone ask what made him happy, what kept him going, or what he feared when the lights went out. They didn't see him. They saw a placeholder, a maybe, a what if. The sense of defeat was heavier than any weight he had lifted on the job sites, and unlike physical exhaustion, this kind of tiredness settled into his bones. He picked up his phone, staring at the screen for a moment before pressing the call button. Emily answered on the 3rd ring. "Ben?" she said, still using the alias. "I'm done," he said quietly. No anger, no bitterness, just truth. "I've tried. I've walked these streets, worked these jobs, sat across tables from 3 women who smiled and nodded and left me feeling like less than nothing." Emily didn't respond immediately. He continued. "They don't want a man. They want a story they can sell, or a sponsor they can drain. Nobody is looking for real anymore, just the next thing that can help them get ahead. Maybe love without money is a myth. Maybe it always was. For a few moments, the only sound was static on the line. Then Emily spoke, her voice unusually soft. "Can I tell you something, Brandon?" she asked. He didn't answer, but she went on anyway. 10 years ago, I met my husband. Back then, he was living in a borrowed trailer on the edge of town. No job, no degree. Just a man with tired eyes and a heart that hadn't given up. Everyone told me to stay away. My friends, my family, even my boss at the time. They said I was wasting my potential. But I saw something in him. Something no one else bothered to look for. He didn't give me flowers or jewelry. He gave me time, kindness, a feeling that I mattered, even when he had nothing else to offer. Brandon stayed silent, but something in his chest shifted. Emily continued. We struggled at first, shared one pair of decent shoes between us, skipped dinners to pay rent, but we never stopped believing in each other. 10 years later, we're still here. He's the reason I believe in people, and the reason I'm helping you do this now. Brandon blinked, staring at the cracked wall in front of him as if her words had drawn a window he never noticed. Don't let 3 women convince you that kindness is extinct, she said gently. Sometimes the right one just hasn't crossed your path yet, but when she does, you'll know, and she won't care about what you have. She'll care about who you are. Brandon rubbed his forehead, his eyes stinging, not from tears, but from fatigue laced with reluctant hope. He had built empires by trusting numbers, reading people, and taking risks. But love, as it turned out, wasn't a business transaction. It wasn't predictable. It didn't come with guarantees. He thought of Emily's story, of 2 people who had started with nothing but walked together through storms and sunlight alike. Maybe he was wrong to give up. Maybe he hadn't gone far enough. Maybe if he really wanted to find truth, he had to strip away even more. The dust on his clothes wasn't enough. He needed to lose everything the world associated with value, even dignity, if that's what it took. He cleared his throat. "Emily?" he said. "Yes," she replied. "Let's take it further," he said, voice low but steady. "How far?" she asked, surprised. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street below. "I'm not going out as a broke worker anymore," he said. "That's still too close to something respectable. I want to find someone who doesn't care about status at all. I want to see if there's anyone out there who would care about a man who looks like he's lost everything." He paused. "I'm going to become homeless." Emily didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet breath, she said, "Okay, I'll help." It was the final decision, not just of the experiment, but of the man himself. He wasn't testing women anymore. He was testing the world, testing the idea that love could still bloom without masks, without polish, without promise. That night, as he folded his few clothes and pulled an old blanket over his shoulders, Brandon Carter let go of comfort, expectation, and fear. All he had left was a question, and the courage to find the answer. The transformation was complete. Gone were the worn jeans and faded t-shirts that had once helped Brandon blend in with the working class. Now he looked like someone entirely invisible to the world. His hair was unkempt, thick and matted from days without brushing. His beard had grown wild, curling unevenly across his face. He wore a threadbare hoodie with holes at the elbows, mismatched gloves, and pants that sagged and dragged slightly at the cuffs. His sneakers had been replaced by rubber sandals with cracked soles, and slung across his shoulder was a torn cloth sack, stained, faded, and filled with nothing but a bottle of water, a dry granola bar, and a folded piece of paper that could change a life. Inside the lining of his shirt, tucked close to his chest, was a check written for $5 million, signed in quiet ink by Brandon Carter himself. He wasn't planning to cash it. He was planning to give it away, to the first person who showed him kindness without expectation. Emily had arrived early that morning, with the final items in a plain duffel bag. She said nothing as he dressed, only handing him the check in a small sealed envelope. "Give it to the right one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon nodded, eyes steady but heavy. He knew that this level of disguise could expose him to danger. He was stepping into a world where no one cared about last names, corporate titles, or net worth. He would be seen, at best, as a nuisance, at worst, as a threat. But it had to be real. If love was to be found, it had to grow in the cracks of the forgotten places, not in the spotlight of curated lives. He began his days before sunrise, walking city streets while shopkeepers pulled up shutters and buses hissed to life. He sat at the edge of public parks, in the corners of parking lots, and outside subway stations, his sack in his lap, hoodie drawn low. He didn't beg. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He simply existed in plain view and watched how the world moved around him. Most people didn't see him at all. They stepped around him, stared through him, or quickened their pace as they passed. Some clutched their bags tighter, others whispered and pointed. A few tossed coins, never making eye contact. He thanked them softly, but even then, they rarely acknowledged his voice. Each location had its own rhythm. The open-air market was busiest in the morning, filled with shouting vendors and distracted customers. The bus depot buzzed with commuters rushing to escape their reality, not noticing the man sitting quietly on a cracked bench. Brandon changed locations daily to avoid recognition, but also to widen his search, for compassion, for connection, for anything real. The sun baked his skin in the day, and the wind bit through his thin clothes at night. He found shade beneath overhangs and warmth from the exhaust vents of laundromats. He ate little, spoke less, and carried with him only the memory of what it meant to be someone in the world's eyes. Days passed, then weeks. The city pulsed around him like a living organism, busy, loud, and indifferent. Brandon observed people who claimed to care, only to reveal their performative kindness. One woman, stylishly dressed, knelt beside him to take selfies, forcing a smile onto his face. She posted the photo with the caption, "Helping the homeless today, feeling blessed," and walked off without offering food or even a word. Another girl bent down with a smile and said, "Poor guy, you look like you've been through it." He responded, his voice barely audible, asking if she had a bottle of water. Her expression turned cold. "Oh, so now you want something," she laughed, then turned to her friend and mocked him loudly as they walked away. At night, Brandon sat in alleyways or beneath bus shelters, his thoughts tangled in the quiet. His back ached, his hands were raw, and sleep came in short, restless bursts. Sometimes he dreamed of his old life, bright offices, polished floors, his name on golden plaques. But more often, he dreamed of silence. Not the kind that suffocated, but the kind that healed. The silence of real conversation, the pause after a genuine question, the stillness of someone staying beside you without needing to speak. That was the silence he missed, the one he had never truly known. And yet, in all this discomfort, something inside him settled. He was no longer afraid of being seen as small. He wasn't afraid of the judgment, the dismissal, or the stares. What scared him now was the idea that no one might see past all this at all, that compassion had become currency and kindness a form of social theatre. He clutched the check in his chest pocket more than once a day, not for reassurance of its value, but to remind himself of the mission. He wasn't here to prove he could endure poverty. He was here to prove that something deeper still existed in the world. One evening he sat beneath the flickering sign of a closed tailor shop, his knees pulled to his chest and his hoodie soaked from a recent downpour. His fingers were numb. His stomach ached. But more than anything, his heart felt hollow. Not because he was unloved, but because he feared the world had forgotten how to love at all. As the rain fell again in slow, persistent sheets, Brandon whispered to himself through chattering teeth, "Just one. I only need to find one." The city didn't answer, but the story wasn't over. Not yet. The days blurred together like rain on a dirty window. Brandon's hands were cracked, his lips dry, and his hoodie clung to him with the heaviness of sweat and city grime. He had sat on so many sidewalks, leaned against so many brick walls, and waited at so many intersections that he lost count. From sunrise to dusk, he remained silent, still, and invisible. Most people didn't even glance his way. Those who did often looked with quick judgment, eyes that flinched or narrowed, as if his very presence were an offence. Mothers pulled their children closer. Young men smirked and whispered. Teenagers made jokes under their breath, laughing as if poverty were a costume, as if his life, his pain, was their afternoon entertainment. But it wasn't the silence or stares that broke him. It was the moments of false hope, the brief flickers of kindness that turned cruel within seconds. One afternoon, Brandon sat by the edge of a bus terminal, his knees drawn up and his hood over his head. The crowd moved fast, but then someone stopped. A girl, maybe 23, knelt beside him. She had soft curls, big eyes, and a bright purple tote bag that said, "Empathy is everything." "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Her name was Zoe, and she offered a smile that felt warm. Brandon looked up, unsure, then nodded weakly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and held it toward him. But just as he reached out, she pulled it back. "I'm kidding," she laughed, standing up and waving her phone. "But that was sweet. You looked so hopeful." She walked away giggling, her voice rising over the crowd as she called someone. "You won't believe what just happened." Brandon sat frozen. The ache in his stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from humiliation. He hadn't begged. He hadn't asked for pity. All he'd done was answer her question, accept her kindness, and for that he became a joke. Not a person, a punchline. His fists clenched, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Something inside him went still. Some quiet corner of his heart curled inward, like a flame retreating into smoke. He reminded himself why he was doing this, but in that moment it didn't matter. He didn't feel brave or noble. He just felt discarded. The next day brought more of the same. At a busy intersection near a shopping mall, Brandon sat cross-legged beside a rusted trash bin. His sack lay beside him, and his face was turned toward the pavement. He didn't need to see people anymore. He could read them by their footsteps, hurried, hesitant, hostile. Then came the sound of heels clicking and a sugary voice. "Oh my God, you look like a character out of a sad movie," the girl said, squatting down beside him. She was dressed in a pastel tracksuit, her nails long and painted gold, her phone already aimed at his face. "Can you look up for a sec? Smile a little? Let's make this real." Her name, he would later learn, was Lily. She took 3 selfies beside him, each with a new pose, each more dramatic than the last. "Helping the needy is such a vibe," she said, adding the caption, "Och blessed, Dutch give back," or humble heart, before uploading them instantly. Then she stood, gave him a little wink, and walked away. No food, no water, not even a goodbye. He watched her disappear into the crowd, his reflection distorted in the glass windows behind her. It was a strange sensation, being used for someone else's validation while still starving in the same spot. Brandon was no longer shocked, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. For every person who turned away, there were a few who pretended to care, not for the sake of kindness, but for applause. He saw it again and again. People kneeling beside him to film a TikTok. Influencers doing fake giveaways with no intention of following through. A businessman who handed him a flyer for a church and then told his assistant to take a photo for the newsletter. The performance of compassion had become a currency of its own, and Brandon had become the prop. At night, he lay on a piece of cardboard behind a shuttered florist shop. His bones ached. His pride had been scraped raw. But worst of all was the creeping doubt. What if this is all people are now, he wondered. What if we've forgotten how to care without an audience? What if sincerity was something we left behind with handwritten letters and face-to-face conversations? Brandon had once believed in data, logic, and outcomes, but none of those things explained what he was seeing now. He wasn't testing individuals anymore. He was uncovering a culture, a world where value was measured in clicks and comments, not connection. Still, he rose each morning. He kept walking. He changed spots, changed posture, even changed the way he breathed. Not because he had hope, but because he wasn't ready to let despair win. Deep down, some fragile part of him still clung to the idea that someone, somewhere, might kneel beside him and see a person. Not a project, not a photo opportunity, not a burden, but a man, tired, lost, worth loving anyway. He held on to that thought like a flicker of flame in a downpour, because the world was showing him its ugliest face, but maybe, just maybe, it hadn't shown him everything yet. The rain came without warning, crashing down from the sky in thick, heavy sheets, the kind of storm that turned city streets into rivers and rooftops into drums. Brandon sat hunched beneath a rusted zinc awning outside an old tailor shop, its sign faded from years of sun and neglect. His hoodie was soaked through, clinging to his skin like a second layer of cold. The water pooled around his feet, his fingers trembling from hours of exposure. Passers-by rushed by with umbrellas and ponchos, barely sparing him a glance. His knees were pulled tight to his chest, his sack damp and forgotten beside him. The city, as always, moved on, faster when it was inconvenient. He had grown used to this, expected it. But that day, something shifted. From across the street, a woman dashed through the rain, her plastic slippers slapping against the pavement, one hand gripping an umbrella and the other clutching a small nylon bag. She paused abruptly when she reached the awning, her eyes landing on Brandon with a flicker of concern instead of disgust. She didn't stare. She didn't step back. She simply looked and saw. "You're getting soaked," she said, her voice soft but firm. Brandon looked up, blinking against the rain dripping from his lashes. Before he could speak, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small container wrapped in cloth. "It's rice and beans," she said, offering it with both hands. "I cooked it this morning for lunch, but you look like you need it more than I do." He hesitated, not because he didn't want the food, but because kindness had become foreign, something he'd only seen twisted or manufactured. But her eyes held no performance, no pity, just quiet sincerity. He reached out slowly and accepted the container, his fingers brushing hers. She smiled, then untied the patterned shawl wrapped around her shoulders and gently draped it over his. "This one's dry," she said. "You'll get sick sitting like this." He didn't speak, unsure if he even could. His throat ached from silence and disbelief. "I'm Grace," she added, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level. "I sew clothes here. That's my shop, and I teach part-time at a nursery school just down the street." She didn't ask for his story, didn't demand to know why he was sitting there soaked and silent. She simply acknowledged his existence with the kind of grace that didn't need to be earned. Brandon felt something uncoil in his chest. Not relief, not joy, something older, deeper, a recognition of humanity. She stood again, brushing raindrops from her sleeve, then glanced toward the tailor shop's entrance. "The rain's not letting up any time soon," she said. "If you want, you can sit inside until it does. It's nothing fancy, but it's dry. I'll be sewing anyway." He stared at her, unsure if he had imagined her words. No one had offered him shelter since he began this journey. Not once. Not for warmth, not for compassion, and certainly not without strings. Brandon nodded slowly, gathering his soaked belongings as he followed her inside. The shop smelled of fabric and detergent, the air faintly warm from a tiny electric heater buzzing in the corner. Rolls of cloth leaned against the wall, measuring tapes hung like ribbons from pegs, and half-stitched garments were neatly arranged on a table beside a worn sewing machine. She cleared a small stool for him, handing him a towel without a word. He sat there, still unsure of the moment, of the woman now seated across from him, threading a needle with the quiet confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer him a sermon or an awkward glance. She simply continued working, allowing him to exist in the same space without shame. As he sat in the corner, towel across his shoulders, Brandon realized how rare this feeling had become, being treated with dignity without having to earn it. Grace didn't look through him. She didn't treat him as broken or less than. She offered help without expectation and presence without pressure. For the first time in weeks, he felt warm, not just from the heater or the shawl, but from the safety of her silence. It was the kind of warmth that reminded him he was still human, still worthy, even after all the rejection. As the rain continued to drum against the roof, he whispered, "Thank you." She glanced up, her hands still busy, and smiled. "Everyone needs someone sometime," she replied. "I've had my share of someones too." And just like that, something fragile and profound was born, not romance, not rescue, but something more valuable, recognition. Grace saw a man where others had seen a burden. She offered him space without assumptions, a seat without suspicion, and warmth without hesitation. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but in a world full of noise and judgment, it was everything. The days that followed slipped by gently, like fabric between fingers. Brandon never meant to stay longer than a few hours in Grace's shop that rainy day, but the storm had stretched into the evening, and she didn't seem to mind his presence. In fact, when she noticed he had rearranged the cluttered thread drawers while she was busy stitching a blouse, she smiled. "You're more helpful than most of my paying interns," she joked. From then on, it became a quiet routine. Every morning, after walking from the shelter of a nearby alley where he still slept, Brandon would arrive at the shop just before Grace finished her morning tea. He swept the floor, dusted the fabric shelves, and sometimes walked parcels to customers across the neighborhood. She never asked for his help, and he never expected anything in return. It was a rhythm, unspoken, simple, honest. Over time, their words began to multiply, no longer just about errands or thread colors. Grace told him about her students at the nursery school, how one little boy insisted she was a princess because she wore headscarves that shimmered in the sun. She laughed when she said it, tucking a loose curl under the scarf that wrapped her hair like a crown. Brandon listened, and for once he didn't feel the need to lead the conversation or impress. He told her about growing up in the countryside before moving to the city, carefully omitting the parts about business empires and Forbes magazine covers. He wasn't lying. He was editing, for self-preservation, for the sake of something real. Their laughter started small, a chuckle at a crooked zipper, a grin over a spilled cup of tea, but laughter became a language between them, filling the quiet gaps between sewing and sweeping. Sometimes they would sit in silence as the sun dipped low and shadows painted the shop's wooden floor. Brandon began to recognize the comfort in those pauses, how she never rushed to fill them, how she let silence breathe without suspicion. Grace wasn't afraid of quiet. She lived inside it like a woman who had nothing to prove. And in that calm, Brandon found something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind you buy with a retreat or a vacation, but the kind that grows when someone accepts you without condition. One evening, as they sat outside the shop sharing roasted corn and spiced peanuts wrapped in newspaper, Brandon leaned back and stared at the sky. The stars were faint through the city haze. Grace noticed him smirking to himself. "What's funny?" she asked. He turned to her, eyebrows raised playfully. "Did you know I'm actually a billionaire?" Her eyes widened for half a second, then she burst out laughing. "Oh, yeah?" she said, elbowing him. "And I'm secretly the Queen of England." He chuckled too, his voice catching just slightly. "No, really. Private jets, penthouse views, the whole package." She grinned, pretending to sip tea with her pinky raised. "Well, Your Highness," she said with a mock curtsy, "thank you for blessing my humble shop with your royal presence." She didn't ask him to prove it, didn't probe, didn't take the joke seriously, and somehow that was the most relieving response of all. Grace wasn't the type to be swayed by shiny things or grand declarations. Her eyes weren't hungry for wealth. They were steady, always searching for substance. That night, as they cleaned up and locked the shop, Brandon thought about how different the women from his previous dates had been. They would have asked 100 follow-ups, searched for hidden clues, or outright demanded proof. Grace had simply laughed and returned to sweeping. In the following days, their routine deepened. Brandon started learning how to sew. His stitches were clumsy, his thread often tangled, but Grace was patient. She corrected him gently, her fingers guiding his through fabric folds and seams. He was a quick learner, but more importantly, he was willing. Customers began to recognize him, not as the stranger on the sidewalk, but as the quiet man who helped carry bags, who offered them tea, who smiled without expectation. Grace never introduced him with any title. "This is Brandon," she would say simply. That was enough. No last name, no status, just a name, and the trust that came with it. And in that shop, amid spools of thread and patterns pinned to corkboards, Brandon Carter, the man who had built towers, signed million-dollar deals, and graced stages filled with applause, began to build something greater than any company, a bond rooted in truth. Not wealth, not charm, not legacy, just two people folding fabric, folding time, and folding into each other's lives one moment at a time. It was late Friday evening when Grace hesitated at the sewing table, her needle paused mid-air. Brandon had just finished sweeping the shop and was placing spools of thread back into their compartments when she finally spoke. "There's something I need to ask you," she said, not looking up. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed a nervous tremble. Brandon raised an eyebrow, silently encouraging her to go on. "It's my mother's 50th birthday this weekend," she said. "The whole family's gathering at my parents' house, uncles, cousins, everyone, and they've been asking about me, about who I'm seeing." She finally looked at him, vulnerability peeking through her usual strength. Would you come with me? Just for the day. Just pretend to be my fiancé." The request hung in the air like mist, strange, unexpected, intimate. For a moment, Brandon didn't speak. Then he smiled, a slow, genuine grin. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Saturday morning arrived with golden sunlight filtering through dusty curtains. Grace wore a simple lilac dress that brushed her knees, her scarf tied elegantly over her hair. Brandon had trimmed his beard just enough to appear presentable, wearing a button-up shirt with sleeves rolled and dark trousers that were clean but modest. They boarded a small local bus headed to the town where Grace had grown up. As they approached her family's compound, the noise of laughter, clinking cutlery, and rhythmic Afro beats grew louder. Plastic chairs crowded the yard, steam rising from massive pots of jollof rice, fried plantains sizzling on grills. Grace's hand found his, squeezing it briefly before they stepped through the gate together. It wasn't long before eyes turned to them. The first to approach was Angela, Grace's older sister. She wore a sleek green gown with gold earrings that swung with every calculated step. Her makeup was flawless, and her tone even sharper. "So this is him?" she asked, folding her arms as she gave Brandon a head-to-toe scan. "Your fiancé?" Grace nodded, trying to stay composed. "Angela, meet Brandon." Angela didn't extend a hand. She raised one eyebrow and chuckled. "You couldn't find someone taller or cleaner," she said under her breath, just loud enough. Grace's jaw tightened, but Brandon gently touched her arm, signaling calm. "Nice to meet you," he said evenly, his voice steady, respectful. Angela tilted her head, unimpressed, then turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd. Things didn't get easier. Brandon could feel the judgment hanging in the air like smoke. Every cousin seemed to squint at his shoes. Every aunt whispered behind folded fans. Then came Derek, tall, flashy, and too loud for the quiet setting. Grace's ex-boyfriend walked into the gathering like he owned the house. He wore a crisp designer shirt, one that, ironically, had the Carter Global logo printed discreetly near the collar. Brandon recognized it instantly, a limited release item from a collection he himself had greenlit months ago. Derek grinned at Grace and then turned toward Brandon. "So you're the new guy," he said, extending a limp handshake that Brandon returned with a firm nod. "Grace has interesting taste these days," Derek smirked. "From SUV to bicycle, huh?" A few nearby relatives chuckled awkwardly. Grace stepped forward, her eyes flaring. "And yet I'd still choose Brandon 100 times over, because he respects me, because he doesn't cheat with his secretary and then blame it on stress." Derek's smile faltered. The table went silent. Grace turned away without waiting for a response, leading Brandon toward the food table. Brandon said nothing, even though part of him burned inside. He could have revealed everything. Could have snapped his fingers and had black cars roll up, security guards announce his name, or simply handed Derek his own business card. But he didn't, because this wasn't about ego. It was about Grace, and standing beside her, being her choice, was enough. Later, as the sun dipped low and lanterns began to flicker on, the family gathered around a long dinner table. Her mother, a firm woman with piercing eyes and a voice that could command silence, stood at the head. "Brandon," she said, motioning for him to speak. "What do you do for a living?" Brandon smiled gently, folding his napkin. "Little things here and there," he said. "Odd jobs, deliveries. I'm figuring things out." Her lips pursed. "So, no stable job? No property? No car? How exactly do you plan to take care of my daughter?" Before Brandon could respond, Grace interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "Mom, I'm happy. Isn't that enough?" Her mother looked between the two, clearly unsatisfied, but said nothing more. That night, as the celebration wound down and fireworks burst in the distance, Brandon stood quietly near the garden gate, his hands in his pockets, staring up at the stars. Grace walked over, brushing invisible lint off his sleeve. "Sorry about all that," she said softly. Brandon shook his head. "It's okay. I expected worse." She looked up at him, eyes soft. "You handled it with grace." He laughed under his breath. "That's ironic, considering you're the only Grace I care about impressing." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. In that moment, he knew. This wasn't just another day in disguise. This was the beginning of something real. Tested by fire, held up against judgment, and still standing strong. The invitation had come from one of Grace's old college friends, a housewarming party for Juliet, who had just purchased a modern flat in one of the city's newer luxury estates. Grace hadn't seen Juliet in years, but the message had been warm, full of emojis and exclamation points. "Bring your man. I can't wait to meet him." Grace had hesitated before asking Brandon if he wanted to come along. She didn't want to put him in another uncomfortable position, not after what happened at the birthday party, but Brandon had smiled and said, "If you're going, I'm with you." And so they went, Grace in a soft grey gown and flats, Brandon in a plain shirt and trousers that were neat but simple. No brands, no watches, just the two of them, arriving hand in hand at a place where status was worn like perfume. The apartment was immaculate. Glass panels, leather furniture, a wide TV flashing music videos in the background. Juliet opened the door with a high-pitched squeal, air-kissed both Grace's cheeks, and then looked Brandon up and down. "And who do we have here?" she asked, tilting her head. "This is Brandon," Grace said proudly. "My fiancé." Juliet's smile froze for a fraction of a second, then returned. "Oh, lovely. Come in." The room was full of sleek hairstyles, tailored suits, and the scent of imported cologne. Conversations buzzed about stock options, relocation packages, and job offers in Dubai or Singapore. Grace and Brandon found a quiet corner, but the stares followed them like shadows. Whispers began quickly. "Isn't that Grace? Wasn't she top of her class? You'd think she'd end up with someone more polished." One girl looked directly at Brandon's shoes and muttered, "Thrift market special." A guy in the corner laughed. "He looks like he came to fix the AC." Juliet's voice cut through the air again as she passed by with wine glasses. "So, Brandon, what do you do?" she asked, her tone light but edged with challenge. Brandon smiled calmly. "Just trying to make my way," he replied. The room chuckled softly, discreet but not kind. And then, after an awkward pause, Juliet turned to the security guard at the door and said lightly, "Please make sure he doesn't wander around. These condos are expensive." Grace's eyes flared, but before she could speak, something outside shifted. It began with a hum, low, powerful, unmistakable. Then came the sound of engines, Heads turned. Through the wide estate gates, 3 black SUVs rolled in, gliding silently like panthers in formation. Behind them, 2 sleek sedans followed. The DJ turned down the music. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The first SUV stopped, and a tall man in a suit stepped out, scanning the crowd before opening the rear door. A familiar woman emerged, poised, efficient, dressed in corporate black. Emily. She walked straight toward Brandon, her heels silent on the tiled floor. Then, with a soft bow, she said, "Sir, everything is in place." Gasps rippled through the room. "Sir?" someone whispered. "Who is she talking to?" Phones were raised, cameras clicked. Then came the rest of the team. Security men in discreet gear, lining the walls, watching silently. Brandon stepped forward, gently letting go of Grace's hand. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a folder, and opened it. "My name is Brandon Carter," he said, his voice clear and calm. "I am the CEO of Carter Global Holdings and the only son of Arthur and Elaine Carter." There was silence, thick, stunned, absolute. A girl in the back dropped her wine glass. A guy checking Google gasped, "He's worth $500 million." All eyes turned to Grace, standing quietly in the corner, her cheeks flushed but her gaze steady. Brandon walked back toward her, every step intentional. The room parted for him. No one dared speak. He stopped in front of her, took a breath, and then dropped to one knee. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it slowly, revealing a ring that glimmered beneath the estate's golden lights. "Grace Bennett," he said, voice shaking slightly. "You gave me food when I was hungry, shelter when I had nothing, and kindness when the world turned away. You saw me before anyone else did, and for the rest of my life, I want to keep seeing the world through your eyes. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes as her hand flew to her mouth. She couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the shock, the truth, the sincerity. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, stronger. "Yes, Brandon, I will." The room erupted, not in applause, but in stunned, awkward awe. Some clapped slowly, others simply stared. Juliet tried to approach, stammering apologies, but Brandon didn't look at her. His world had narrowed to the woman in front of him, the one who saw beyond his rags and into his heart. He stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into a quiet, full embrace. Phones flashed. Hashtags began to trend. Beggar Billionaire. Love wins. Carter proposal. But Brandon didn't care. In that moment, everything else faded. For the first time, the truth wasn't a burden. It was a gift, one he had waited a lifetime to give, and only one woman in the world had truly earned. The press conference was scheduled for a quiet Wednesday morning, but by 9 a.m., the steps outside the Carter Global Towers were flooded with reporters, photographers, and camera crews from nearly every major media outlet in the country. They had come for one reason: to witness what was now being called the most unexpected love story of the decade. Rumors had already circulated, headlines buzzing with phrases like "Beggar Billionaire revealed" and "CEO proposes to seamstress who saved his soul." But no one knew the full truth, and Brandon Carter had decided that it was time they did. Not for PR, not for damage control, but for the one woman who had stood by him when he was invisible. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, not flashy, just clean and classic, Brandon stepped onto the podium beside Emily, who stood with a proud but composed smile. He adjusted the mic, paused, and then began. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've spent most of my life building a reputation, managing a company, and appearing in rooms where people only saw my name, not my heart. But a few months ago, I chose to walk away from that, to learn if love, real love, still existed without status or wealth." He paused again, letting the silence settle. "During that journey, I met someone, a woman who didn't know who I was, who gave me food when I was hungry, who gave me warmth when I was cold, who gave me dignity when I had nothing. Today, I want the world to meet her." He extended his hand, and from the side of the stage, Grace emerged. She wore a soft cream dress, her hair pulled back simply, her fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with his. Flashbulbs exploded, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brandon held up their joined hands. "This is Grace Bennett, my fiancée, the woman who reminded me that compassion is not for sale, and that love isn't earned through titles, but through truth." Gasps turned into applause. Reporters shouted questions, cameras zoomed in, and the story took flight across every platform within minutes. But for Brandon and Grace, the moment wasn't about media coverage. It was about standing in the light together, no longer hiding. No more disguises. No more doubt. Back in her hometown, Grace's family gathered around a small television, mouths agape, eyes wide. Her mother sat in silence, hand over her heart. Angela, the sister who had scoffed at Brandon's shoes, wiped tears from her cheeks as realization hit like a tidal wave. They had judged too quickly, assumed too much, and now the world was watching the woman they had underestimated stand beside one of the most powerful men in the country, not because she had chased him, but because she had loved him without knowing who he was. That evening, Grace's phone rang non-stop. One by one, her family called, apologizing, crying, asking for a chance to make things right. But not everyone handled the truth with grace. Derek, who had once mocked Brandon at the birthday party, was having a very different kind of day. A quiet internal audit at the company he worked for, ironically a supplier under the Carter Global umbrella, had uncovered discrepancies, misappropriated funds, ghost accounts. Brandon hadn't ordered the audit, nor did he need to. Karma had its own sense of timing. Within 48 hours, Derek was terminated and quietly blacklisted from several major corporate circles. He tried to do damage control, but it was too late. His arrogance had caught up with him, and the man he had insulted at a dinner table now stood miles above him, not just in wealth, but in integrity. Back in the city, Brandon sat with Grace at a small cafe near her shop, tucked away from the chaos. He placed a thin envelope in front of her. Inside were documents for a new boutique space, legal ownership transferred to her name, along with a check for $100,000 to fund her dream, a full fashion line built from her hands and heart. Grace stared at the papers, then looked up at him, her eyes full of something deeper than gratitude. "I can't take this," she said softly. "Why not?" Brandon asked gently. She took a breath. "Because I didn't help you for this. I didn't feed you to earn a store. I didn't give you my shawl hoping for a reward. I did it because it was right, because you looked like you needed someone." Her voice was steady. "And that's all I ever needed to know." Brandon was silent for a long moment. Then he folded the envelope back up and smiled. "I know, and that's exactly why you deserve it." But Grace didn't budge. "Let me earn it," she said, "like everything else in my life." That moment was more powerful than the proposal, more profound than any speech. It told the world who Grace truly was. Not just a woman with a kind heart, but a woman of principle, of self-respect. And it reminded Brandon, once again, why she had passed a test no one else even realized they were taking. That night, as the press replayed his speech, as investors praised his character, and as hashtags exploded with praise, Brandon turned off the news and looked across the table at the woman who had changed his life. She was sipping tea, her slippers half off her feet, humming a tune under her breath. She was exactly the same woman he had met in the rain, with no makeup, no agenda, and no clue who he was. And yet, to him, she was everything. Not because of the world's applause, but because of the way she'd treated him when no one else would even see him. And in that quiet room, far from flashing cameras, Brandon Carter knew. Humility had never looked more beautiful. The Carter estate stood like a monument to power. Tall, white columns, sprawling marble floors, glass walls that reflected the city skyline. Inside, the air was colder than usual, even though the temperature hadn't changed. Brandon sat across from his parents in the grand sitting room, the silence between them a tension he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. His father, Arthur Carter, leaned back in a leather chair, unreadable as always, his fingers steepled in front of his chin. His mother, Elaine Carter, was pacing near the windows, her heels clicking with every sharp turn. She had just returned from an overseas business trip and had barely unpacked before demanding this meeting. The headlines had reached her, the photos, the press conference, and most of all, Grace. "This isn't going to work, Brandon," Elaine said finally, her voice clipped and cold. "She's not from our world. She doesn't understand what we do, what we represent." Brandon remained quiet, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. His father spoke next, tone level but firm. "You're the heir to Carter Global Holdings. Your choices reflect on the brand, on the board, on every major partnership we've cultivated over decades." Elaine walked back toward him, holding up a tablet. On the screen was a photo of Brittany Whitmore, daughter of a powerful senator, dressed in designer fashion at a political gala. "This," she said, "is who you should be seen with. She's smart, well-connected, and her father is willing to offer us the Pacific Highway contract. Billions, Brandon. Generational leverage. Influence." Brandon looked at the photo without emotion. "I'm not marrying a contract," he said calmly. Elaine's face tightened. "This isn't about feelings. This is about the Carter name, about legacy. We didn't build an empire so you could throw it away for a woman who sews clothes in a wooden shop." Brandon stood up slowly, his height towering over the room's grandeur. "She's not just a woman who sews. She's the reason I believe in people again, the reason I remembered what integrity looks like." Arthur's voice cut in sharply. "Are you really going to risk everything? The company? Your inheritance? The seat you've been groomed for since you were 20? Brandon didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. "I'd rather lose all of that than lose her." Elaine turned away, furious. Arthur exhaled, shaking his head. "Then you're making your decision," he said. Brandon nodded. "I already have." His mother walked over to the mahogany table near the fireplace and picked up a folder. "If you walk away from Brittany, you walk away from this." She opened the folder, revealing documents: board removal, trust suspension, corporate restructuring. Brandon didn't even look. "Do what you have to," he said quietly. "I'll find my own way." The silence that followed was the kind that carved walls between generations. And just like that, Brandon walked out, not just of the room, but of everything he'd once been promised. That night, he returned to Grace's neighborhood, his steps slow, his chest hollow from the confrontation. But the small shop was closed. The lights were off, the shutters drawn. He knocked gently, then again, then harder. No answer. He walked around to the back alley, where she sometimes sat drinking tea after work. Nothing. He called her phone. It rang twice and then went to voicemail. He checked the shelter nearby, the school where she taught. Nothing. Grace had vanished, and she had left no sign of where she went. What Brandon didn't know was that earlier that morning, Grace had stood in front of her bathroom mirror, hands trembling as she held a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines. She had stared at it for almost an hour, the weight of it sinking into her soul like a stone. She had known the baby was coming, had felt the difference in her body, but now, seeing the confirmation, everything became real and terrifying. She thought of Brandon's face when he left to speak with his parents, of his mother's voice, cold and polished, of the looks she'd received at the party, and she made a choice. Not because she didn't love him, but because she did. She packed her few clothes, locked up the shop, and left a simple note under the sewing machine. "I love you with all my heart, but I won't be the reason you lose everything. I'll be okay. Please don't look for me. Love always, Grace." Then she boarded a bus to a quiet town 3 hours away, where a friend from college had offered her a temporary teaching position and a place to stay. She didn't tell anyone she was pregnant. She didn't call. She changed her number, because deep down, she believed she was protecting him. Brandon returned to the shop every day for a week, then every few days, then once a week, each time hoping she might walk out the door again with a roll of fabric or a cup of tea in hand. But she never did. He hired private investigators. They came back with nothing. She had disappeared, like smoke in wind, and with her went the light he had found. His parents believed he'd come crawling back. The board waited for him to change his mind. But Brandon didn't. He didn't try to win back his position. He didn't try to undo the damage. He simply stood still, carrying the ache of loss, not of power or wealth, but of the only person who had ever made him feel whole. And in a quiet room, far from the towers he once ruled, Brandon sat with Grace's note in his hand, reading the last words she ever wrote him, over and over. Not because they hurt, but because they reminded him what love really was. Sacrificial, brave, and sometimes silent. Brandon had always been a man of control, of strategy, of precision, of measured risk. But in the weeks following Grace's disappearance, all that he once relied on fell apart. His routines dissolved into obsession. Every morning he woke early, hoping for a message, a sign, a clue. Every evening he returned to her old neighborhood, asking around with fading hope. The shop remained shuttered. The light in the back room never turned on again. He called shelters, schools, hospitals, anywhere she might have gone. Each time, he heard the same thing. No one by that name here. And so he searched, quietly, relentlessly, with the kind of desperation that only comes when someone loses the one thing they can't replace. Emily watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't say much, didn't ask questions. She simply made calls behind the scenes, ran names through private networks, and combed through security footage when needed. It was Emily who finally found her. One afternoon, sitting at her desk in Carter Global's now restructured headquarters, she received a quiet ping on her screen. A contact at a rural health clinic had forwarded a volunteer newsletter. In the corner of one photo, blurred but unmistakable, was Grace, smiling gently, her hand resting on a pregnant woman's shoulder. Emily stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. Brandon drove 3 hours that same evening. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, didn't bring security, didn't make a scene. The clinic was modest, with a rusted gate and painted letters above a wooden sign, Hope Springs Medical Outreach. The waiting area was quiet, with chipped tiles and soft fluorescent lights. And then, there she was, standing near a doorway, dressed in a pale blue cardigan and flat shoes, her hands folded gently over her small but unmistakable baby bump. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she looked tired, but peaceful. Grace. She turned just as he stepped inside. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The world around them faded. No words, no explanations, just the overwhelming current of recognition and unspoken love. Brandon crossed the room slowly, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. When he reached her, his voice cracked. You're carrying our child?" She nodded, tears already slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I didn't want to burden you. You had already lost so much." Brandon's hands shook as he reached out and touched her stomach, then pulled her gently into his arms, holding her like a man who'd found home again. "You were never a burden," he said, his voice barely holding together. "You were the only thing that ever made sense." They sat outside the clinic for hours that night, beneath a sky littered with stars. She told him everything, how she'd fled to protect him, how the whispers from his family echoed in her mind. He listened without judgment, his fingers wrapped around hers. Then he stood up, pulled his phone from his pocket, and made one quiet call. "I'm coming home," he told Emily, "and I'm bringing Grace." The next afternoon, Brandon brought Grace back to the Carter estate. Not through the service entrance, not quietly, but through the front door. The same doors he'd walked out of weeks ago, stripped of everything but his choice. This time, he returned not alone, but with the woman who had taught him how to love beyond titles, beyond legacy, beyond pride. Elaine Carter sat stiffly in the parlor, her fingers looped around a porcelain teacup. Arthur was beside her, unreadable as always. Grace stood quietly by Brandon's side, her hand resting again over her stomach. She didn't speak, She didn't shrink. She simply stood. Brandon stepped forward first. "This is Grace," he said. "You know her name. Now I want you to know her story." And slowly he told them everything. How she'd found him in the rain, how she'd given him food without asking for his name, how she'd offered him shelter without ever knowing who he was. He told them about the birthday party, the laughter, the shawl, the sewing machine. He told them about the baby, about her sacrifice, about the note she left behind, not for drama, but to protect him from pain. There was silence when he finished. Then Elaine stood. She walked over to Grace, her heels clicking softly across the floor. For a second, she just stared, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I judged you. Not because of who you were, but because of what I didn't understand. I was wrong." Her words were slow, hesitant, but honest. "You gave my son something I never could. Peace. And now, a family." She looked down at Grace's stomach, then back up. "Thank you." Arthur nodded once. He didn't speak, but the way his eyes softened was enough. Later that night, the Carter estate felt different, softer. Brandon and Grace sat beneath the balcony in the garden, wrapped in a blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. The baby kicked gently, and Grace placed his hand over the movement, smiling. "He's strong," she whispered. Brandon kissed her forehead, like his mother. And in that quiet moment, no cameras, no crowds, no boardrooms, Brandon finally felt whole. Not because he had reclaimed power, not because he'd won approval, but because he'd found her again. Because fate, despite everything, had led him back to the only truth that ever mattered. Love that didn't need to be seen to be real. It just had to be felt. And in Grace's arms, he felt it. Completely. The morning of the wedding dawned with the soft glow of golden sunlight spilling over the Carter estate. But it wasn't the wealth or grandeur that gave the day its magic. It was the silence that settled over the garden as hundreds of chairs were carefully arranged beneath a canopy of white roses and draped silk. The estate had never looked more elegant, but it had also never felt more human. The staff moved with a quiet reverence, as if they understood that today wasn't just about a CEO or his bride. It was the culmination of something rare, something real. Brandon stood near the archway, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, his nerves hidden behind calm eyes and a gentle smile. He had spoken at investor summits, addressed rooms of world leaders, and made billion-dollar decisions without blinking. But today, he trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from overwhelming gratitude. Across the estate, Grace stood before a mirror in a room she never imagined stepping into, wearing a gown of ivory lace designed by one of the world's top fashion houses. An anonymous gift once the press learned her story. But Grace had added her own touch, a delicate sash sewn by her own hands with the same thread she used back in the days when she stitched garments late into the night in her tiny shop. Her hair was pulled into soft curls beneath a veil, and in her hands she held a bouquet of lilies. The same flowers Brandon had once said reminded him of her, quiet, strong, and timeless. As she looked at herself, she didn't see a transformation. She saw a continuation of love that had weathered storms, of truth that had outlived rumor, and of a future that was finally beginning. The ceremony began with a hush as guests from every corner of the world took their seats: CEOs, journalists, childhood friends, tailors, school teachers, and even strangers who had followed their story. Brandon stood under the arch, heart pounding, as the music swelled. Then she appeared. Grace, walking down the aisle, not escorted by power or title, but by the steady beat of her own courage. Every step was a chapter, every breath a victory. And when their eyes met, the world melted away. When it came time to speak their vows, the air itself seemed to pause. Brandon took Grace's hands in his and spoke first. "You met me when I had nothing," he said, voice thick with emotion. "No title, no name. You looked into my eyes, not my past. You fed me when I was hungry, sheltered me when I was lost, and loved me before I remembered how to love myself." Today, I stand before you not as a CEO or a billionaire, but as a man who is finally enough, because you made me whole. Ah, tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she smiled through them. Then it was her turn. I didn't know your name, she began softly. I didn't know your worth, but I knew your heart, and I saw the kindness, the humility, the quiet dignity in you. Not the kind money gives, but the kind that hardship shapes. I never wanted anything from you, Brandon, except the truth. And today I give you mine. I will walk with you through everything, riches and ruin, comfort and chaos, light and shadow, because our love didn't start at the top of the world. It started at the bottom, and it bloomed anyway. When the officiant finally said, "You may now kiss your bride," the crowd erupted into a chorus of joyful cheers, but none louder than the sound of Grace's laugh as Brandon lifted her veil and kissed her with every ounce of tenderness he had stored in his soul. Doves were released, a string quartet played their favorite melody, and the air shimmered with the kind of celebration that only happens when something impossible becomes real. The reception was grand, yes, celebrated beneath a glass canopy lit with 1,000 golden bulbs, but it was also deeply intimate. Brandon danced with the seamstresses who had worked with Grace in the early days, while Grace sat laughing with Brandon's father, who now looked at her like the daughter he never knew he needed. Elaine Carter, once so opposed, held Grace's hand during dinner and whispered, "Thank you for teaching us how to love without fear." Within days, their wedding became global news. But the headlines weren't about designer gowns or VIP guest lists. They were about her, about the woman who fed a stranger and in doing so changed the trajectory of a life. Their story was told in newspapers, on podcasts, in documentaries titled Beyond the Billion and Grace and the CEO. Couples wrote to them from around the world, thanking them for proving that love still mattered, that it wasn't all apps and agendas, that sometimes it really was about kindness, timing, and the willingness to see someone without needing them to be perfect. And so Brandon and Grace began their life together, not in the shadows of judgment or behind the walls of expectation, but hand in hand under an open sky. They traveled. They raised their child. They returned often to that small-town clinic where their hearts had found each other again. And no matter how far they rose, they never forgot how low they had begun, because that was where their roots had taken hold. In the end, their love didn't just survive the test of wealth and status, it redefined it. It reminded the world that while money can build empires, only love can build legacies. And for Brandon and Grace Carter, that legacy had only just begun. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of love beyond status, don't forget to support our channel Deep Inside HQ. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who still believes in kindness, authenticity, and second chances. We bring you stories that dig beneath the surface and shine light on the quiet strength inside ordinary people. Join our community and help us continue telling the stories that truly matter.